Hello and welcome. Here we're going to check out a set of Civil War trading cards. This is going to be from Tuff, and they present the famous battles of the Civil War, the 100 card set, Series 1. And they have other exciting sets: World War II, Pearl Harbor, Johnny Clem, the little drummer boy of the Civil War, and these are from 1991. So let's check these out and see what history abounds and what things we could learn about and find in this set. We'll try to open it carefully and preserve these cards. Let's get our opener here. It's our multi-use pointing tool, but right now it is a perfect opener. And away we go. So let's take these out. We have these two stacks in the 100 card Series 1 set. So we'll start, I think that's through 50, and then these go through, 100. So here's going to be our full stack. And let's check them out and see what we've got, learn a little bit of history, and find out what these cards have in store for us. So let's see if we can, there we go, get a good view. And once we get a good distancing, perfect, here we go. All right, so first up we have the Peninsula Campaign. And I won't go through, wait a second, that's 42. This is number 2. It does not look like they are collated. Wait, that's 3, 4. All right, maybe they are. I would have hoped that they were, unless I put these on 19. All right, let's try to go through the set. So it's 38. Let's try to go through, that's 49. Yeah, let's try to go through in order. And there's 50. So is this 77, 52, 53. All right, so somehow in their packaging, maybe they wanted certain cards on the front. They're definitely not in perfect order, though we'll just kind of cruise through and we'll be fine that way. So first up we have is the Peninsula Campaign. Some details over there. Fort Sumter. Talks about Major Robert Anderson and General Pierre Gustave Beauregard, PGT Beauregard. Another Fort Sumter card. And words from Mary Chestnut. And Fort Sumter again. Talks about negotiations with the Confederate Major General or Major Anderson. And Fort Sumter drawing. A recollection from the Union Sergeant. And this talks about the 128-man garrison. And the formal surrender coming on April 14th. And here's a bit of a map of the area. Fort Sumter sitting in the center of Charleston Harbor. And here appears to be the Lincoln family. And talks about the beginning of the war A house divided against itself cannot stand. The words of Abraham Lincoln. And as we will see more of in the war, there's Jefferson Davis, the current Secretary of War under President. He was the Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce, and later a senator. Brother against brother. The war had begun, and Lincoln authorized an U.S. Army of 75,000 men to serve for 3 months. And the streets of Charleston were crowded with soldiers, reported Mary Chestnut. Some of those who volunteered were so young it was almost incomprehensible. Drummer boy Johnny Clem was only 10 years old when he joined. And this is Sam Watkins of Company H of the 1st Tennessee, saying every person almost was eager for war, and some were afraid that it would be over before they could join. Interesting dynamics. They may think differently a couple years later. In 1863 or 64 even, it was tough for everybody. Believing in the war would be a short one. Some soldiers took servants along with them. Some even carried dress suits and a whole lot of spoons and forks to live comfortably. And just quotes from different folks. And what's incredible about the photography from that era is that the plates that they were made on were such high resolution. You can even see good resolution, in this reproduced photo, that even today, looking back at those original prints and the negatives, you could see extreme detail, which is incredible. And just talking more about the dynamic of the war. Many boys ages 16 and 17 wrote 18 on a slip of paper and put it in their shoes so they could honestly tell the recruiters they were over 18. Another quote, I knew 6 men over 60 years who volunteered and served in the ranks, recalled a member of Virginia's Richmond Howitzers. Talks about the wives, daughters, and mothers and the role of women in the war. And so Union soldiers were paid around $13 a month. Confederate soldiers received around $2 less, around $11 per month. And one of the first major battles is going to be Bull Run. And both sides were impatient. They wanted a quick end to the action. And this was one of the first major battles. It would also make it a very real experience. The scene from the hill was grand, regiment after regiment coming along the roads and across the long bridge, their arms gleaming in the sun. A reporter from the Washington Star, looking at the Battle of Bull Run. Early on, it was seen almost as entertainment. People would come to the battlefield and sit and watch. It was really an interesting kind of approach to it. And talking about McDowell's troops and PGT Bureau Guards coming together at Bull Run. And I'm realizing this set will, I think, be kind of like a walk through the war. It's almost like a mini look into history as we go. And I know this is series 1, so I don't know if this goes through the entire war, but in pretty short order, we'll find out. We're already on card number 24. This is talking about the initial charge of McDowell's troops at Bull Run. And then Joseph E. Johnston's reinforcements, the Confederates making a stand. And the afternoon counterattack by PGT Beauregard. And here is more intense action. What a horrible sight it was, a Union officer said. And the first major battle ended on Monday, July 21st, 1861. 387 Confederate casualties, including, about 2,000, and the North had around 2,500 overall. And Major Sullivan Ballew's letter of the 2nd Rhode Island. I believe that letter was quoted also in Ken Burns' documentary. So that is, of course, an incredible watch. And here's the map of Bull Run. We have Manassas, obviously the marker there, depending on from whose perspective we're naming it, right near the Potomac and right across the water from Washington and near the James River. And there's the national park there now. And we move on next to Shiloh. The battle-victorious forces of General Ulysses S. Grant moved south toward Shiloh, Tennessee, in an effort to cut the South in half by controlling the area east of the Mississippi River. General Johnston's 40,000 rebels swept across the rolling Tennessee countryside of blossoming peach trees toward the army of General Grant. So a lot of strategy going into where these battles happen as well. The Confederates hammer the Union forces. And by evening, the Federal lines had been forced back several miles towards the Tennessee River, but it had not yet been broken. General Johnston was lost, and command of the rebel forces passed to General Beauregard. Brigadier General William Tecumseh Sherman had encamped on a hill not far from Shiloh Methodist Church. At the end of the first day's battle, Beauregard wired President Davis that he had won a complete victory. But come morning, Grant's forces, now reinforced to 50,000 men, would counterattack. A lot of casualties overall, around 10,000 for the Confederates, and around 21,000 for the Union. So numbers are getting significantly larger, from around 3,000 each at Manassas to 10 to 20,000 each at Shiloh. Here's the map of Shiloh. Right by the Tennessee River. Proved to be the first truly brutal battle. And there is a Shiloh National Park there as well. Now we move on to the Peninsula Campaign. And word spread the South was building an ironclad ship. And here is card number 1 that we hadn't seen earlier, all the way from Fort Sumter. So we will put this at the bottom of our pile. And then on we go. President Lincoln had replaced General McDowell with General McClellan. McClellan's forces first laid siege to Yorktown, but did not act for almost a month while more armaments were being brought ashore. And I believe there was a kind of criticism of McClellan being slow to act in general. I believe, and that may be the first key inclination of that. McClellan's forces began to bombard Yorktown in late April, and the Confederates answered with intense shelling of their own. The Union forces' rewards for taking Yorktown were heaps of oyster shells, empty bottles and cans of preserved fruit and vegetables. So it didn't seem like that much of a victory in terms of resources. Confederate General Joseph Johnston's troops had a fierce holding action around Williamsburg before moving towards Richmond. McClellan's troops followed at a slow pace as the Confederates retreated towards Richmond. I feel like this is almost like a story when we're in school and the teacher like reads a page and then turns the book around to show everyone. I kind of would like to be on the watching end of this. This is kind of fun. An interesting aspect of the Peninsula Campaign was the Union Army's use of hot air balloons for observation. And here's a map of the Peninsula Campaign. And you have the James River here, the Potomac here, Washington here, and again that first Battle of Manassas right up here. So not very far away. We've got that, and then also the notorious Harper's Ferry. So a lot of action right around this Richmond, Petersburg, Manassas, Fredericksburg area. You'll know that becomes a very key part of the war. And on we move to the 7 days. This is card number 77, so I believe out of order. So I'm going to keep this tucked aside, and we'll put that back when it is right. Here we have Jackson's Valley Campaign, card number 52. So Jackson had a force of around 16,000 men, facing potentially overwhelming odds against McDowell's nearly 60,000. A Confederate officer complained to Jackson that if he followed his orders, he would lose his men. And Jackson would preach to always mystify, mislead, and surprise the enemy. Never fight against heavy odds. And Jackson attacked a small Union garrison at Fort Royal on May 23rd and sent it retreating. and he also swept down on Major General Nathaniel Banks' main army at Winchester on May 25th, pursuing them all the way to the Potomac. And his troops saying that he drove them pretty hard as a leader. And Jackson achieved his victory at Front Royal in part because of a young woman spy. The information that the Union forces numbered only about 1,000 had come from a 17-year-old Belle Boyd. And by knowing the Union forces were very small, Jackson was able to more confidently execute his plan. General Banks' retreat to the Potomac put a scare into Washington politicians and citizens. Jackson began moving his men towards Richmond to reinforce the Confederate units stationed in a defense line around the city. President Davis charged General Robert E. Lee with saving the Confederate capital. And so here you could see all the different conflicts of the Valley Campaign. Kernstown, Winchester, Front Royal, Woodstock, Newmarket, Cross Keys, and Port Republic. Again, right near across the Potomac from Washington, and a little north of Richmond, and a lot of key areas of the war. And we have Seven Pines, Fair Oaks. While Jackson was chasing Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley, Confederate General Joseph Johnston's 54,000 troops were shoring up the defenses around Richmond. The Chickahominy River cuts the James River and York River Peninsula, and it forced McClellan to split his advancing forces into two groups. General Robert E. Lee rode along 9 Mile Road on Saturday, May 31st, with his aide, Colonel Charles Marshall, in search of General Johnston's headquarters by Fair Oaks. When Lee arrived, Johnston did a strange thing. He did not divulge to Lee his plans and almost declined to explain his intentions, wrote historian Clifford Doughty. Johnston began giving orders to his officers, but continued to keep his intentions from Lee. Johnston left his headquarters to go to the battle, keeping Lee and President Davis, who arrived shortly thereafter, in the dark. General McClellan, stationed with his troops north of the Chickahominy River, heard the sound of fighting. He then ordered Major General Edwin V. Sumner's corps to cross the river and aid his compatriots. The limited engagement at Fair Oaks could have been a victory for the Confederates, but they failed to press the enemy. The Battle of Fair Oaks is considered by many historians to not be much more than a skirmish. But for a small battle, the North had lost around 5,000 casualties and the South around 6,000. So when looking at our previous battles, Manassas was around 2 and 3. This was about double Manassas casualties, which is pretty significant. Wasn't as rough as Shiloh with 10 to 20,000 each, but still. Fair Oaks had around double the Manassas casualties. On hearing Lee had succeeded Johnston, McClellan professed to be pleased, I prefer Lee to Johnson. Lee is too cautious and weak under responsibility, and Johnson had a different reaction. And here's the map of the Seven Pines, also known as Fair Oaks. And again, here we are, right around Richmond. And we move from 7 Pines into 7 Days. Lee assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia, the way he took on every task with a master plan. At the end of June, Union General McClellan was working on a timetable for taking Richmond that seemed maddeningly slow to his president. And there we're seeing more of that perception of McClellan moving slowly to take action. In simplest terms, Lee planned to overwhelm the Federal troops north of the Chickahominy, and placing his own forces on the line of the York River Railroad would force McClellan to leave his earthworks east of the river to protect his line of supply. On Thursday, June 26th, the 7 Days battle began. It was early afternoon, humid and hot, and around 3 p.m., the quiet around the village of Mechanicsville was broken by the crackle of musket fire. The battle around Mechanicsville began to come apart for the Confederates. Jackson's reinforcements failed to arrive as planned, and Brigadier General Roswell Ripley had led his men directly into the Federal line of fire. Lee was back at Mechanicsville on June 27th. This time he assumed a loose command of the field action, something he had failed to do the first day. And then here we have our card that we had pulled earlier that was out of order. Card number 77. As night fell over Gaines Mill, there was great confusion among forces on both sides. This is an earlier card, 51. We'll look at that after we wrap up 7 days. A lot of casualties from that fighting. And some quotes of the hard fighting from those days. People talking about the awful sights of war. And it seemed to have changed from the early battles where people would picnic and watch to now people really understanding the impacts of what was going on and what the experience was. So now we're at 7 days 2. So we're going to look at this card that was out of order. This is earlier from Jackson's Valley campaign. So we won't go too far into it, but we will tuck that back in order into the stack. And now we have 7 days 2. General Lee had General McClellan on the run after his defeat at Gaines Mill, but confusion, problems, and hard fighting loomed ahead. Lee ordered Major General John B. Prince John Magruder to pursue the Yankees near Fair Oaks. The plan called for Magruder's forces to be supported by those of Jackson and Major General Benjamin Huger. So Lee is taking active pursuit, something McClellan did not seem to be doing. The only brigade to make it all the way to the Federal main line at Savage Station was the one commanded by General Joseph Kershaw. And I believe he would play a role at Gettysburg as well, though I definitely need to confirm that. And here we have 7 days 2. Magruder's failure was a temporary setback. Lee was determined to drive McClellan off of the peninsula, and the Union general's forces fell steadily before him. Lee was depending on Jackson to spearhead the drive against McClellan, but Jackson failed to produce. He allowed himself to be thwarted by Federal defenses at a bridge across White Oak Swamp and spent the afternoon of June 30th doing essentially nothing. The two divisions of Longstreet and A.P. Hill totaled under 20,000 men. They attacked Federal forces twice their number, but briefly broke the Yankee line of General George A. McCall. So there's another example of a smaller force defeating a larger force with sound tactics. Despite the loss of hundreds of men taken by the Confederates, the attack achieved little of importance, resulting only in the capture of some woods the Yankees had occupied. So it seems while a victory was of little actual substance gain. The Confederate Army approached Malvern Hill around noon on July 1st. The Federal position was well protected. On the night of July 1st, 1862, McClellan retreated from Malvern Hill to Harrison Landing on the James River, giving up his goal of taking Richmond. The 7 days' battles were over. General Lee had saved Richmond, but at great costs. I grieve to state that our loss in officers and men is great, he wrote to President Davis. So when you think about this, this is kind of mid-1862, around a year or so after the war started. There was a pretty strong effort by the Union to take Richmond and then theoretically end the war. And about a year later, we're going to see a bold move by Lee, moving north into Gettysburg, at a similar attempt to overtake northern lands and kind of cut the Union in half and try to also end the war. So some interesting land logistics in terms of how war played out in the 1860s. And here's a map of 7 days. Mechanicsville, Gaines Mill, Savage's Station, Frazier's Farm, and Malvern Hill. Now again, right around Richmond, the James River. So waterways would play a big role. And on July 4th, Independence Day, a truce was called between the Union and Confederate forces east of Richmond. Now we have the Second Bull Run. After the failure to take Richmond, President Lincoln gave the command of all Federal troops north and west of Richmond, previously part of McClellan's Army of the Potomac, to General John Pope. The new army was called the Army of Virginia. Tall and bombastic, Pope had commanded Union forces in the Western theater of the war. And so essentially we're starting to see a lack of confidence in McClellan, the idea that he's moving slowly, not decisively. Now some of the major part of his troops were reassigned to another general, and that will likely foreshadow some other decisions to come. And the Second Bull Run, Pope was despised by Southerners because of the way he treated civilians, encouraging his men to seize food and supplies from farms and being relatively unkind to those around him. Pope next met General Jeb Stuart's forces, which raided his headquarters and got away with $35,000 in cash, Pope's dress coat, and a notebook outlining the disposition of Pope's men. That's a lot of cash, $35,000 in 1862. And I wonder what it says, too, around him allowing his area to be raided like that. Second Bull Run. Stung twice, Pope announced he would bag the whole crowd, and he attacked Jackson's troops on August 29th at the site of the first Bull Run. Longstreet's 5 divisions stormed Pope's forces along a 2-mile front. Longstreet pressed and Pope's forces until 10 p.m. the night of August 29th. And then his forces lay down on the battleground to sleep, while all around were strewn. Must have been quite a sight. "I am not stampeded," a furious Philip Kearny told a fellow officer after the Confederate defeat of his troops on August 29th. The Federals conducted a well-ordered fighting retreat, and on September 1st, across the Bull Run Creek and headed towards Washington. Their casualties were nearly twice that of the Confederates. So again, we're seeing large casualties there for the Northern Army while they're in the South. Clara Barton was at Second Bull Run. She began her work among Union troops in 1861, collecting and distributing brandy, tobacco, lemon, soaps, and sewing kits. She would become a camp follower and help as the troops moved along. And here's the map of Second Bull Run. And we have the different regimental positions: Lee, Jackson, Longstreet. And right in Gainesville, Manassas Junction, and Centerville. And there we go. So there we have our entire set. I'm going to take this card here, which is 51, and tuck that. Wow, perfect spot. First try. Put that right in. And there we go. So this is the Series 1 of the Civil War cards by Tuff Stuff from 1991. And I would say overall, interesting. Like, I like them a lot. They're informative. They're easy. It actually gives me the idea of, something like this could be a great way to learn most anything, especially like a sequenced period, like episodic, if you will, event such as the American Civil War, where you've got one thing happening after another. This could be a very fun way to engage with history. It could be, for anything, science, or it could be, sports, or, pretty much any avenue of history, the Wild West, American Revolution, things like that. We can kind of learn step by step and kind of be ingrained in one moment at a time with a photo and a description. So overall, I think these are pretty cool. Definitely worth a look. I am curious if they came out with a Series 2. I'd love to see the Gettysburg cards and kind of go through them. So I'll keep an eye out for that. But overall, I'd say here is a pretty cool set of cards from 1991. The Civil War. Let me get the package. There we go. 100 card set, Famous Battles of the Civil War by Tuff Stuff, Series 1. There you have it. I hope you learned something as we went through, and I hope you had some fun. There you have it. Until next time.